Welcome back to another episode of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm your host, Susie Selleck, here today at the Historical Society in Rossville, Illinois, and I'm joined by Jerry Cornell and the longest-serving, oldest-living mayor of Rossville. And I'm going to come right out. Terry Perlman, tell me who founded Rossville and when was it founded?
It's my understanding it was founded by a man by the name of Jacob Ross in 1859. It was incorporated in 1862. That's the extent of my knowledge on that.
So, Jerry, Rossville has had a couple other names previously. Can you talk about that?
Of course, the first settler here, it was John Liggett. And it was a grove of trees. See, in the prairie, you didn't see any trees unless you're along the creeks, riverbanks. And we have the North Fork branch of the Vermilion River, and that's where you have a grove of trees. And this John Liggett built a cabin here, and it was always referred to as Liggett's Grove, as an Indian trail went through here in about 1829. And of course, after that, in the 1840s, the settlers started coming in and became known as henpeck. Now, there's no really. It just always said that, but I never, could find proof it was written down as henpeck, but it was referred, Rossville, before Rossville, was called henpeck.
Jerry, can you talk about where the first settlers came from?
The most noted settler that everybody knew back then was Abram Mann, and there was a senior because he had a son, Abram Mann, they referred to as Junior, but the senior came from England, and he developed a section of land south of Rossville, and he enticed a lot of fellow Englishmen back in Essex County to make the journey over because of the availability of being able to own land, where back in England, the only way you owned it is if you inherited it. Mm-hmm. You just didn't, go out and buy a farm. You just worked for a farm or you owned it, So that's how my great-grandfather got over here.
Terry, I'm throwing this question to you because I think a former mayor might know. When was Rossville incorporated?
It was actually incorporated in 1862. Places like Chicago and Springfield had the lakes and the rivers. Right. And transportation was a big thing back then.
So Chicago and Springfield, they were incorporated earlier than Rossville, right?
Yes, probably 30, 35 years earlier.
Okay. All right. Now, I also understand, was there a discrepancy between when it was incorporated?
Yes, some of the books show it 1872, but I believe there's documentation in City Hall that shows 62.
We're going with 62. You're good with
That's
that?
what I go with.
Okay. Now, Jerry, do you want to add anything in there?
You got to realize we're on the Great Prairie here, created by the glaciers that came through here. This flattened the land. Even one of the early pioneers, fur trader Gordon Hubbard, was amazed when he climbed to the top of an oak tree in Chicago, which was nothing but a fort and a couple log cabins, and he looked across and saw for the first time this massive prairie. But it turned out you couldn't take a wooden plow or an iron plow and turn the soil over so thick and sticky. And so when the German settlers came, they thought, if this doesn't grow trees, it's not going to grow corn. And they went to places like Effingham, southern Illinois, or went to Wisconsin. So it was just last settled that way, unless you was around these groves, like Liggett's Grove. You had those kind of settlements. But when Oliver Plow Company in 1856 or John Deere had this self-polishing steel plow, 1849, that's what opened up the prairie to farming. And so otherwise, and then again, you didn't have any trees to build cabins. But by that time, we were getting, better roads, railroads, and you got to have drainage. You cannot farm this ground without tile in the ground. If you looked at the top of the soil and x-rayed it, it looked like veins and all over. It has to drain into the ditches and creeks to get the water out of the soil to be able to plow and plant. So that's why we were last settled.
Terry, can you talk about some of the village's early setbacks?
Yes, probably the first one that I can think of would have been the fire of 1893. Then we also had a fire of 2004. The setback was the loss of the Rossville Canning Company. Another setback was the loss of Conagra, which had purchased, I think, the canning company. And they left in 2011. That was 150 people that employed down here that we left. That's a major one. Jerry, you want to add something to that?
Yeah.
I know one time we had a shoe factory in Rossville, and I read in a book they employed over 400 people. Now, I'm not sure what building that was in, but the old hardware store. Okay, but and I know that there was a fire 3 times at the high school. They built a high school in '68, shortly after the Civil War, expanded it, and it burnt down like in '72. Then they built another one, and it burned down in about 10 years later. So they built a third one, a 2-story brick building, and in 50 years later, 1945, in October, it went up in flames. So in the meantime, they had the classes held like here in the township building, Opera House, some of the churches, some of the businesses. Yeah, and for a couple of years, because it wasn't until 1950 until they were able to build and occupy the new building, which is there today. But we haven't had high school since 2005 because of consolidation and
called a consolidation. No, it's co-op. Co-op. We're only one of 2 schools in the state of Illinois that are co-op school. Co-ops, okay. Outside of Paris, Illinois.
Jerry, where were the 2 fires?
1893 fire. It was the southeast corner of the Main Street, intersection between Route 1 and Attica Road. Mostly wooden buildings, and it just totally leveled it. And they rebuilt, and of course they were wise about rebuilding. They put firewalls in those buildings, and they were able to withstand any. We do have a couple empty spaces where the building's gone, but it didn't take anything else with it. But in 2004, that fire was on the opposite side, would be the southwest side, and those didn't have any firewalls, and it got up in the attic of the first building that was on fire, and it went right through everything, and so it all had to come down. And of course, today we have a sizable-looking filling station, convenience store. It seems to be the heartbeat of the town now. Everybody kind of meets up there to do things. Yeah.
Jerry, can you talk to us a little bit about Gene Hackman and the connections he has to Rossville?
The actor Gene Hackman, his great-grandparents ended up in Rossville. They were Indiana folks. Ezra Hackman and Amelia. He was in the Civil War when he got on leave after about 3 years in fighting in a division called the Iron Brigade. And if you look that up, they went through the test of fire. They were one of the toughest and most feared by the Southern troops. When they saw their tall hats, they had special. After he survived that in the 3rd year, he got on leave and he married Amelia. And then he went back and finished the war, and they went to Watseka, and the Hackmans then came to Rossville. And from there, there's like 6 or 7 kids, and one of those boys was William Hackman. That's Gene's grandfather. He was actually worked at the Rossville Press until the Spanish-American War, which he volunteered. He was in Battery A of the Illinois Volunteers. They weren't going anywhere. They sat a long time, and finally our area Congressman Joe Cannon, who became later Speaker of the House when Teddy Roosevelt was president, he went into action. He says, well, he wanted his boys to see some of the war. They finally got them off to Puerto Rico, where they set up going to lay siege on San Juan. And just before they opened up fire, they came down that there had been a truce, so they never shot a shot in anger. they came back and disbanded. And he got his old job back at the Rossville Press. And in 1911, William, or Bill Hackman, they called him Bill back then, he got onto the Danville Commercial News. And he worked there and at the courthouse reporter until 1949 when he retired. Now, his son, Gene's dad, worked also at the Danville Commercial News. He was a pressman. He was a typesetter. And he had another son, Orrin Hackman, who was a sports writer. So Gene had a lot of relatives, and you know, when Bill moved to Danville, when he got his job as a commercial news, they still came back for these Sunday dinners, which really was common up here. You know, get together the family. So yeah, that Gene came up here a lot of times with his dad or with his grandparents, and he would be on the Thomas farm, because that's Bill Hackman's sister, Emma Thomas, was married to Oscar Thomas. And they spent a lot of Sunday dinners that way. And I'd read in the Rossville Press, they were, you know, who's doing what in Rossville. And I'd always see the Hackmans coming up from Danville for a visit. So finally, when Gene was 13, his father abandoned the family. He was kind of more grown up then, because he had no father figure. He would come to Rossville to earn extra money working on some of the family farms up here. He would take a bus or train, and that's how he earned his money when he's 14, 15, before he could get into serious jobs in Danville when you're a little bit older. And he'd stay sometimes with his grandpa Bill's brother, Abe Hackman, and their sister Lulu. Those two never married, but Gene sometimes stayed with them and worked on a farm or something for extra money, or just had fun in Rossville as a kid would.
While we're on the topics of movie stars and celebrities, tell me about Bill Mortz.
Billy Mortz, the only son of Lloyd and Susie Mortz of the 6 children, graduated from Rossville High in 1983. And all the time I'd known Billy and the family, he wanted to be a stuntman. That was his lifelong ambition. In fact, my son Mike actually taught him basic karate. Yeah. And Bill went on to Hollywood and did all the prompting, the studying, and the classes to become a stuntman. And after I saw Billy just a couple of years ago, and he said he had metal rods, metal braces, metal plates all over his body from the stunt field. That's a very dangerous field.
Oh, yeah, it is.
And now he's actually teaching stunt classes and so forth.
So, Terry, as we were driving through town, several magnificent buildings. One of them was the Opera House. Please tell us about the history.
Well, it was built in 1908. And I was told the cost was around $25,000. Jerry might correct that, but the local people decided they needed their own opera house and a place where they could have plays. In fact, my great-grandfather, maybe even grandfather, were involved in that. A few years ago, they were redoing sidewalks here in Rossville, and the cornerstone of that building came loose. And the contractor found embedded into the back of it was a little copper container that held the names of all the masons and so forth, and gave it to the owner of the building, who later gave it to me, and then I gave it to the Historical Society. So, Jerry, do you want to take?
Yeah.
Well, the Masons bought that lot. There was a 2-story wooden building on it. In 1903, had it removed, and by 1904 had built the 3-story opera house, brick building. The very top floor that they housed for their floor work and their initiations, and meetings. But the middle floor, let's go to the first floor, had a theater with a balcony in it, and they would do plays back then. A lot of road actors would come here and practice their acts before they even went to Chicago, the big times, So, yeah, they had a lot of plays, a lot of meetings, ceremonies like graduations were held there. And then even, of course, later, after the high school burnt in 1945, they used that building extensively for classrooms besides other buildings. But the Opera House finally, as movies came out, was kind of less used for the plays. And Harold Kane, he took over the second floor for his metal work, and he operated a lot of, at least 5 employees made grave decorations. Later on, they got into copper and other works, elegant works that they were working and selling to, doing contract work for a Danville company, and it was sold all as antique stuff all over the country. And then finally, the second floor was, as building owners changed, was made into apartments. And I don't know what happened to the Masons. They finally, the initiation didn't keep up, and they kind of lost control of the building. And then it became downstairs a garage, auto dealership. And then J. Strausman, Chickens, Lane's, that was the second floor, I believe. That was the first floor, too. The Lane's Chickens. It's sad, isn't it? But Jay Strausman, when I was young, I remember he had a welding. He was a portable welder, but that was his base of employment there, and he was a prominent businessman back then. And then it became a kind of an antique store later on. Michael and auction house, yeah. But it still stands. It's an elegant-looking building. It could be used for a lot of things.
Yeah,
but
the structural integrity has held up well through the years, through all the different businesses as well. So, Terry, Rossville's been known as a point of tourism for the antiques. So how many antique shops were here at one point?
I can't tell you exactly, but I'm going to estimate between 20 and 25. Several of the buildings would rent space, cubicles and so forth, to other antique dealers. There might have been 7 or 8, or maybe even more, in the one building. And we were actually called the antique capital of Illinois. I have personally seen as many as 7 Greyhound buses with tourists come in from northern Illinois, Wisconsin. In fact, they had trouble finding places to park. It was great. It was started in about late 1960s, early 1970s were the heydays. And every other community said, well, let's see what Rossville's doing. And they copied us. And now we were just one of many.
Okay, yes.
But it was
you
great.
were the pioneers.
A fellow by the name of Joe Whistler deserves the credit for that.
Okay, awesome.
And Terry lives in the house Joe lived in. He owns a Whistler house now. But Whistler, his dad, had a feed and grain store. And I noticed as a young boy, I go in there to buy rabbit food or whatever, and more of the R.H. Whistler's stuff was being moved aside, and these antique furniture was appearing. I thought, what's he doing selling? That was Joe. He was fixing up old furniture people throw away, and he would sell it. And I'd look at the price tag back then. I would, my eyes would pop out. But today it was probably cheap, in comparison. But he put the antiques into Rossville when he did that.
All right, Terry, I think you can talk to us about this next one. Tell us about how the golf course was annexed to Rossville.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting story. It was 1975 or 76, I forget exactly. But the country club is actually located in Grant Township. We're in Ross. Mm-hmm. And Grant Township was dry, no liquor license. And the country club had operated for many, many years without a license. And the way they got around that was they gave the Vermilion County Sheriff a complimentary membership. So that kind of helped. But anyway, somehow or another the state police came in without notifying the sheriff and shut him down. Well, it was a very active country club, had a lot of attorneys in it, and 2 or 3 attorneys came to my office and asked if Rossville would consider annexing the country club so that they could obtain a liquor license through Rossville. In exchange, we would get the real estate taxes and the sales taxes from the country club. Well, that's a no-brainer. And I said, sure, let's go ahead. And I have never seen attorneys work as fast as they did. It only took them about 2 to 3 weeks. And this was an unusual annexation. The last house in Rossville, we went, they actually had a 5-foot strip annexation, and went to the last house, went west to the North Fork River, and then turned north 5 feet all along, and went out to approximately the country club, to a place, a house owned by A.K. Bush, the local dentist, and very active in the country club, and angled back, crossed the road, and then just started following the perimeter of the country club. And it's still that way today. But it worked out for them, worked out for the village. We offered, well, being in the village, they had police protection and fire protection, but no utilities. But that was the funniest thing. Those attorneys worked very, very hard to get that so they could have their alcohol.
So, Terry, behind us is Dr. John Mason's, the replica of his office. Tell us about who he was.
Well, John Mason was a local boy, born and raised in this area, and he practiced medicine for over 50 years. Delivered, I believe it was right at 2,000 babies. Wow. His office was on North Chicago Street. It had been an old filling station, an old gas station, converted. But Doc, he was probably the best diagnostician in downstate Illinois. But to go back when he was young, he worked at the Rossville Canning Company. And one day he told the fellow worker, named Vern Kelly, he said, well, Vern, today's my last day. He said, I'm quitting and going to medical school. And Vern says, John, you got to be crazy to give up a 35-cent an hour job to go to medical school. Well, he did, and he owned quite a few acres around here when he passed away. His oldest son, or only son, John C. Mason Jr., was a baby doctor, I can't think of the name, in Danville until he retired, and he's passed, and his daughter Carol is still living. But they had what was it, in the 70s, Jerry? They had a parade for Doc.
1972, Doc Mason Day.
Celebrating his 50 years in his honor.
Wow.
Parade and everything.
Yeah.
Wow.
He was just a good friend of mine, customer of mine at the grain elevator. He was just one of a kind and a good old country doctor. But his charges were $2 for an office call, and he'd give you a handful of pills and a bottle or two of his cough syrup. I wish we had more of them today like that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
for sure.
Jerry?
Do you have anything to add in there?
Well, he went to the University of Illinois Medical School, and when he got out, he did his internship in Los Angeles General Hospital. He learned a lot there, and he tried different areas. He almost went to Tennessee to practice, and that's where he went. His wife was in California, Ruth Cole, but he realized he was getting into a mistake, and he got back, wrote to a friend back in Rossville and asked for a $100 loan to get him back here. And so he came back here for his practice. Before he did the station, the old gas station, he made into an office. He was up above a barber shop. You imagine going up this flight of stairs, of a 10, 12 feet high building to get to the top for a doctor's office. A lot of patients probably couldn't make that climb, so he knew that was short-lived. But yes, he was always short in his conversation, and they sounded gruff, but he was a good guy. He was really unusual. Yeah, he was a gem.
Jerry, talk to us about who Isel Eugene Hambleton was.
Well, we're referring to the Isel Eugene Hambleton Jr. because his dad had the same name. He was a big horse breeder of Belgian, Persian horses, and he supplied most of the milk for Hoopston for a while. And his son, younger Isel, they just called him Gene Hambleton, and his younger brother, they went to school just north of their farm, west of Rossville, the Squonkam School, the schoolhouses that we had around here in Squonkam. Was by the time Gene Jr. was 6 years old, he had a deal to go up in Wynette, Illinois, the big horse breeder up there. Would hired him to go up there, so that's when he left here. But this guy ends up becoming an officer in the Air Force. He becomes a commander of over missile bases, and he had knowledge of certain missiles. But his fame became more nationally known during the Vietnam War, at the close of the Vietnam War, when the United States was kind of letting the works go to the South Vietnamese Army, and we just more or less backed him up. But he was in a plane, a six-man plane, doing observations, and at the time they didn't know it, but North Vietnam was doing an offensive, invading the South at that time. I think that was in '72. And they got hit they had all kind of surface-to-air missiles, and they were hit, and the pilot told them to eject, and he did, but he's the only one that survived the ejection. And so he's on the ground, but the Russians who are helping the North Vietnamese, they realize the value of this guy. They know who he is, right. Colonel Hambleton, and they wanted him real bad, so they had a massive search for him. And we were sending in helicopters and planes trying to rescue him. And in the course of if you saw the movie Bat 21, which is not totally accurate because a lot of things were still not known, were still secret about what really went on there. So Hollywood makes up things anyway. But it's basically was, he was on the ground. He had to get back to his forces. And they had to finally send in a Navy SEAL and a South Vietnamese Navy SEAL type guy to go up the river, and actually found him after several weeks. He was emaciated almost, but the only way they knew how to find him, they had his radio. He'd be told where to go according to a golf course. He was an avid golfer. I mean, he that's all he loved to do in his spare time was golf. So they told him where to be, what hole on a certain golf course. He knew exactly where he was supposed to be. And that's how he was able to get in a place where they were to snatch him and take him out of there. And, of course, the movie Bat 21, which Gene Hackman stars in that role, played him in that movie. And, again, it's good for entertainment, but not totally accurate. But we did lose lives rescuing him. It was South Vietnamese general says, we're wasting all these planes and men for one guy, but that's sometimes what happened. You have the value of that guy is so important that's the goal. And he was rescued, and he was able to retire and live his life out in I think Arizona on a golf course nearby.
Sounds good. Yeah. Jerry, talk to us about who Gordon Hubbard was.
Of course, that's probably the first question we should have had in the interview, because he was through here before, probably before Liggett had his cabin on the corner of Prairie Road and Chicago Street, we call it. But that was the Hubbard Trail. He came here in Chicago at the age of 16. That's pretty young to come by yourself. But his family his father was an attorney, but he was not getting any work when he went up to Canada from Massachusetts. So he decided to sign on with the American Fur Company, which, Astor being the richest guy in the country. But the only reason why they let a 16-year-old do that because he could both read and write, which a lot of these guys out here in the fur trade, they couldn't do either. But so he came as a clerk to Chicago, and again, it was only a couple of log cabins and a Fort Dearborn, which had been wiped out a few years before in the War of 1812, with the massacre. And he was these different trading posts, and he wanted to know how to get, instead of going through St. Louis, how to get to the Mississippi River as more and more trade had expanded, Indian trade. And so he went south, and this is where he followed a trail along what Indians established, but about 1822, and that became known as the Hubbard Trace or the Hubbard Trail, and which went right through Rossville. So people over the years would know, when they see Hubbard, and he began, when the Indians were gone after the removal policy, he was trading with the settlers in the area. He had a trading post in Danville and in Iroquois County, just north of us. And he was, until 1832, was married to an Indian lady named Watseka, which the town later on adopted that name in Watseka, Iroquois County, the county seat, in her honor. But he never wanted to acknowledge, he didn't come for that celebration. In 1867, no, he was in Chicago then, and he said that wasn't going to happen. But he'd left Danville trading post, and somebody asked him, you're going to go from Danville to this smaller town of Chicago? And he says, well, I think they had a future. And again, when he got to Chicago, he bought some of that Indian land that was up for sale now because the Indians were leaving, and they signed stuff over to him too because he was well liked among the Indians. He was their friend. His nickname was Swift Walker. Because he moved fast, and he outdid any Indian to try to challenge him in any kind of a race. So he married a lady. She was the sister to Doc Fithian's wife in Danville. Doc Fithian's a big name, with Abraham Lincoln one time gave a speech off Doc Fithian's balcony in Danville when he was running for Senate. But he was married to Eleanora Berry, and then after she had a child in Chicago, the child lived, but she didn't make it. And then his next wife was actually as I thought a third cousin maybe, but as I looked at some of her writings, her name, she was a Hubbard, and she was actually a first cousin. So. But they never had any kids or anything. But she outlived him, and he died like 1886. But the Chicago fire wiped him out in 1871. He had written a nice book about his exploits. So he started all over again. All he got was through the Indian years. He didn't get into the years in Chicago where he helped develop that city. If you go across the Chicago River, the first street is Kinsey Street, which is named after the first white family. The next street is Hubbard, and then of course we have Hubbard Country Club, and we have a lot of names up and down Route 1. You'll see the name Hubbard. Yeah. But he started out a fur trade. He went to other, taking hogs and turkeys up Route 1 to Chicago. He opened up on the river a 3-story brick building that he started one end of it butchering hogs. So he started the hog butchering up in Chicago. Another end of the building, he had the first insurance company and opened up a bank. So he was a pioneer of Chicago. He bought the first fire apparatus out of his own pocket, which is in a museum in Chicago. You can see Big Red is still there, that fire. And they have a mannequin of him dressed in his typical fur trapping clothes. I never had taken a picture of that. I don't know why, but that's supposed to be Gordon Hubbard up there. So, yes, he was very important in Chicago and well known because when he came to Rossville in 1876, he was invited by Alvin Gilbert, who was our township supervisor. They were good friends to go hunting, and he was still agile at this age, but And he said, I see where Gilbert kind of moved the trail, the street over, so he had a bigger front yard. That's where the old Liggett's Grove cabin used to be, but then Gilbert had his house there. And he says, if I send out a marker of where the old trail was, would you put it up? And Gilbert, he said yes, he'd like to do that. And within a few weeks, this large concrete monument that says Hubbard Trail 1822 was brought to Rossville. And it's always been here. It's kind of moved over a little bit since then, since they straightened out the street and took that big yard out. So Hubbard was known to all the pioneers of this area personally, and of course in Chicago he's even bigger.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, Terry, talk to us about the Centennial.
Well, from my recollection and talking to some of the people around town, and also things that I saw when I was mayor, that Rossville was just in the doldrums, and they decided they needed a shot in the arm. So these people got together and said, let's have a centennial. And they said, we can't do it because we weren't founded or incorporated until 1862. They said, nobody's going to know the difference anyway. So they had the centennial. And it brought people from far and wide, because no one around here had ever had a centennial. I think they even had a carnival, if I remember right, up at behind the old high school. But it was a good thing for Rossville.
Okay. Well, Rossville does centennials right.
I remember the huge parade we had. We have that on film too. They had the Chicago Stockyard Band with these bagpipes and everything coming down and going through. We had a lot of bands in that parade and a lot of floats. Yes, it was a big deal.
Thank you for watching another episode of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm your host, Susie Selleck, here today at the Historical Society in Rossville, Illinois. Jerry and Terry, thank you so much for having us. And remember, travel slowly and stop often. Bye for now.